April 12, 1943, 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea. The world had been reduced to a screaming, metal-ripping hell. Inside the nose of the B-25C, avenging angel, the sound was not something you heard. It was a physical force that vibrated through your teeth, your bones, the very marrow of your soul. It was the roar of 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously, a solid ripping wave of sound that drowned out everything. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines, the wind screaming past the shattered plexiglass, even the frantic thumping of his own heart. Technical Sergeant Art Lynch's world was a narrow cone of fire and water. Through his gun sight, the Japanese destroyer Yukike's swelled, a monstrous slab of gray steel dominating the entire view. Tracers, a solid river of molten red, poured from the muzzles of his guns, walking up the deck, chewing through gun mounts, superstructure, and human figures. The smell was a potent mix of cordite, hot oil, and ozone, so thick it was a taste, coating the back of his throat. "She's buckling amidships," Art yelled into the interphone, his voice raw. His hands, encased in leather gloves, were numb from the constant, jackhammer recoil that shook the entire airframe. He could feel the plane groaning around him, a living thing in its death throes. Rivets popped like gunshots somewhere in the fuselage. First Lieutenant Jimmy Crow's voice crackled back, strained against the G-forces of their low-level run. "Almost there, Art. Almost. Shit. Starboard engines hit. We're losing power." A violent shudder racked the plane. Art felt it in his seat, a sickening lurch. The distinct, frantic whine of the right engine spooling down joined the symphony of destruction. Thick, black oil smeared the starboard window, obscuring the view. Then came the flak. The Japanese gunners had found their range. Brutal, fist-sized chunks of steel exploded around them in puffs of black smoke. The crump-crumpsrmp of the 25mm shells detonating was a bass note to the Browning's tenor. "Left, Jimmy, hard left." Art screamed. It was too late. A shell tore through the cockpit with the sound of a train hitting a scrap heap. Plexiglass exploded inward. A searing heat washed over Art. He saw Jimmy Crow grunt, his body slamming against his harness, a dark, blossoming stain appearing on his flight jacket. "Jimmy!" Through the smoke and chaos, Art's eyes met those of Staff Sergeant Mike Rostov, who was manning the waist gun. Rostov's face was a mask of terror and fury, his mouth open in a scream lost to the noise. He pointed a shaking finger forward, past Art. Art followed his gaze. Through the oil-smeared windshield, he saw the muzzle flashes of the destroyer's forward gun battery, now aiming directly at them. It was a wall of light, a final, brilliant constellation of death blooming in the gloom, reaching out for them. They were too low, too slow, and there was nowhere left to run. Before we continue this unbelievable story of the mechanic who defied every engineer to build this impossible gunship, make sure you've subscribed. The algorithm favors the engaged, and you will not want to miss the moment, coming up, where we rewind to the Arizona desert and discover how a boy who listened to locomotives learned to make a bomber speak with the voice of God. Subscribe now. The silence of the Arizona desert was a physical presence. It was the sheer, overwhelming absence of sound that had first taught a young Arthur Lynch how to listen. Not with just his ears, but with his fingertips, his very soul. The wind, a constant dry breath across the high mesa, carried the scent of creosote and hot sand. It was a world away from the metallic scream of dying engines and the rip of .50 caliber fire. A decade earlier, and a continent away from the Bismarck Sea, the world was measured in the weight of a wrench and the heat of a steam locomotive's boiler. The Winslow rail yard was Art's cathedral, and his father, Joseph Lynch, was its high priest. Joseph was a man whose hands were a permanent roadmap of grease and scars, his overalls stained with the evidence of 1,000 repairs. "It's not about forcing it, Art." Joseph's voice was a low rumble, a sound as familiar and steady as the idling locomotives. "It's about listening. A machine talks to you. This one." He rapped his knuckles against the massive drive piston of a Santa Fe 2900 class locomotive. "She's got a pain in her knee. A hiccup in the rhythm. You hear it." Art, 13 years old and skinny as a rail, pressed his ear against the warm, gritty metal. He closed his eyes. Beneath the general hiss of steam and the slow, ticking cool-down of the engine, he heard it, a faint, out-of-sync knock, a hesitation in the heart of the giant. "I hear it," Art whispered, his voice filled with awe. "That's the language," his father said, wiping his hands on a rag. "A bearing's worn. It's complaining." A good mechanic doesn't just fix the complaint. He understands why it's complaining in the first place. Integrity, son, in the metal, and in the man working on it. Those afternoons were Art's true education. He learned the heft of a 3-foot-long spanner, the precise torque needed to seat a bolt without stripping it, the way hot steel smelled when it was stressed. He learned to see the invisible forces at play, the pressure in a steam line, the stress on a coupling, the aerodynamic push against a train cab. It was a world of order, of cause and effect, where a problem could be diagnosed, understood, and solved with logic and greasy hands. That orderly world was incinerated on a Sunday afternoon. December 7th, 1941. Art, now 18, was in the small, clapboard house, the radio humming a baseball game. The broadcast crackled, cut out, and then a voice, tight with a controlled panic, began to speak of Pearl Harbor, of battleships named Arizona and Oklahoma, of smoke and fire and sinking ships. Art sat perfectly still, his father's wrench, which he'd been cleaning, cold in his hand. The silence in the room was no longer the peaceful silence of the desert. It was the silence of a void, of a fundamental order shattered. He could almost hear it, the distant phantom screams of men trapped in steel hulls, the roar of enemy aircraft, the shriek of tearing metal. The machines were screaming, and no one had been there to listen, to fix them. He walked into the recruiting office in Flagstaff 2 days later. The air inside was thick with dust motes dancing in the sunbeams and the smell of fresh paint and floor wax. A sergeant with a bored expression looked him over. "Mechanic, eh? We can use you in a maintenance battalion. Keep the trucks running." Art stood straight, his hands, already bearing the calluses of his trade, clenched at his sides. He saw not the sergeant, but the photograph in the newspaper of the USS Arizona, its back broken. He heard not the drone of flies outside, but the ghostly echo of his father's voice. A good mechanic is just a doctor for steel. He looked the sergeant dead in the eye, his voice low but clear, cutting through the stifling office air. "I don't just want to fix them, Sergeant. I want to make them talk back." The air at the Unit 819 proving grounds in Nebraska tasted like dust and exhaustion. It was a different kind of heat than Arizona, a humid, heavy blanket that clung to the skin and filled the lungs with every breath. The wind here didn't clear the air. It just stirred the dirt into swirling clouds that coated the rows of B-25 Mitchells in a fine, pale powder. Corporal Art Lynch stood before a schematic he'd pinned to a splintered hangar wall, the paper curling at the edges. The drawing was meticulous, a product of countless nights under a single bare bulb. It showed the nose section of a B-25C, but transformed. Where the standard bomber had a single modest .50 caliber and a bombardier's chair, Art's design featured a brutalized snout, with 7 additional Browning M2s clustered around the original, their barrels jutting forward like the spines of a metal porcupine. An 8th was positioned in a redesigned top turret, locked forward. It was an act of mechanical violence on paper. "You want to put 8 guns in the nose?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Mike, Milwaukee, Rostov. He was a block of a man, his uniform always impeccably tucked, his disdain as palpable as the heat. He held the official B-25 technical manual in his hand like a Bible. "Lynch, the airframe stress charts for this model explicitly state that the cumulative recoil force of more than 3 forward-firing .50 calories risks structural failure at the wing root. You're not building a gunship, you're building a coffin." Before Art could answer, a smoother, lighter voice cut through the tension. "Sergeant, if I worried about what a chart said, I'd never have learned to fly." First Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Crow leaned against the hangar doorframe, a faint, intrigued smile on his face. He was everything Rostov wasn't: lean, casually elegant even in his flight gear, with a mind that saw regulations as suggestions. He'd been assigned as a test pilot for Unit 819, and Art's heresy had immediately captivated him. "It's not about the individual recoil, Rostov," Art said, his voice low, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. He could hear the distant, familiar idle of a B-25's R-2600 engines on the flight line, a sound he was already learning to diagnose. It's about the distribution. See here. He pointed to his drawing. I've reinforced the longerons here, and here. We spread the load across the entire forward fuselage skeleton. The plane can handle it. It's stronger than the manual says. The manual, Rostov said, slapping the thick booklet, exists because men smarter than you, Corporal, tested these airframes to destruction. They wrote down the limits so that men like us don't have to discover them the hard way at 10,000 feet. The argument was cut short by the arrival of a staff car. 2 men in the crisp uniforms of the Wright Field Engineering Corps stepped out, their faces etched with a preemptive skepticism. The test was on. An hour later, with just a single additional gun mounted for a preliminary trial, the Avenging Angel sat on the tarmac. Art, Jimmy, and Rostov were strapped in. The moment of truth was a brutal, shocking thing. When Art fired the 2 guns, the synchronized recoil was a double-fisted punch into the airframe. A sound like a dozen rifles going off echoed through the fuselage as half a dozen rivets near the new gun mount simply sheared and popped, pinging off the inside of the skin like angry hornets. The Wright Field engineers didn't even wait for the full report. Their lead man, a colonel with a perfectly trimmed mustache, looked at the popped rivets, looked at Art's ambitious schematic, and then looked at Art with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Son," he said, his voice flat and final, "what you're proposing isn't innovation. It's a fantasy. The stress loads are impossible to manage. The vibration alone would shake the instruments to pieces. The official finding is that this design is structurally impossible." He let the word hang in the dusty air, a death sentence for the project. He turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at Art, Jimmy, and a smugly vindicated Rostov. However, command is desperate for new tactics in the Pacific. So, against my better judgment, you get one chance. 1 B-25. You modify it to your specifications. You take it on one combat mission. You prove it. His eyes narrowed, locking on Art. You fail, Lynch, and you'll be painting fuselages in Greenland for the duration. The air over Rabaul Harbor was thin and cold, a stark contrast to the sweat soaking through Art's flight suit. This was not the proving grounds. This was not a theory. This was the reality of war, and it was terrifyingly vast. The B-25C, now bearing the name Avenging Angel in hastily painted letters, felt naked and vulnerable. Instead of the planned 8-gun battery, only 4 Browning M2s jutted from her nose, a compromise forced by time and Rostov's relentless citing of regulations. It was a fraction of the firepower Art had dreamed of, a mere whisper of the thunder he wanted to unleash. Their mission was standard, a medium-altitude bombing run on the Japanese supply docks. The 4 extra guns were a silent, unproven passenger. Art sat in the co-pilot's seat, his eyes not on the bomb site, but scanning the endless, empty blue for the one thing he knew was coming. "IP in 3 minutes, Art." Jimmy's voice was calm in the interphone, a steady anchor in the hum of the engines and the rush of wind. "Look sharp, everyone." Then, the emptiness ended. "Bogies. 9 o'clock high." Rostov's voice screeched from the top turret. "Zeros. 2 of them." Art's heart hammered against his ribs. He saw them then, 2 sleek, dark specks that swiftly grew into the deadly, iconic silhouettes of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. They fell from the sun like hawks, their radial engines building to a scream. The world dissolved into a violent ballet of evasion. Jimmy threw the B-25 into a steep, gut-wrenching diving turn to the right. The G-forces pressed Art into his seat, his vision blurring at the edges. The .30 caliber nose gun, operated by the bombardier, chattered away, its sound pathetic and futile against the diving fighters. Tracers from the Zero's 7.7 mm machine guns streaked past the canopy, glowing lines of white-hot death. "They're too fast. I can't track them," the bombardier yelled, his voice pitched with panic. The Zero on the left overshot, but the one on the right was a master. He matched their turn, sliding into a perfect deflection shot off their starboard beam. In seconds, his cannons would rip the bomber apart. Art's mind, trained on the language of machines, screamed a single, desperate thought. The guns. Use the guns. It was a clumsy, heretical act. There was no central firing control. This wasn't a strafing run. He unbuckled his harness and lunged from his seat, scrambling into the nose. He slapped the bombardier's shoulder. "The forward guns! Help me!" Together, they each grabbed the firing grips of two of the added Brownings. There was no precision, no aimed shot. It was pure, brute force area denial. Art squeezed the triggers. The sound was tremendous, a roaring, four-gun salvo that shook the nose violently. It wasn't the synchronized ripping wall of sound he envisioned, but a louder, more chaotic version of the standard armament. Empty brass casings spewed in a golden torrent, clattering and spinning around the cramped compartment. The smell of spent cordite was instantly overwhelming, a sharp, acidic cloud. He wasn't aiming at the Zero. He was aiming at the sky in front of the Zero. A sudden, unexpected storm of .50 caliber rounds bloomed in the fighter's path. The Japanese pilot, expecting the feeble defense of a standard bomber, was taken completely by surprise. He instinctively broke hard left, his killing shot spoiled, his graceful attack run shattered by the unexpected torrent of lead. It was enough. The distraction gave Jimmy the split second he needed to shove the throttles forward and dive into a thick bank of cloud below. The world went white and turbulent. When they emerged moments later, the Zeros were gone, unable to find them in the murk. The silence in the plane was heavy, broken only by the steady drone of the engines and the ragged breathing of the crew. They were safe. The bomb run was aborted, but they were alive. Art climbed back into the co-pilot seat, his hands trembling, the acrid smell of gunpowder clinging to him like a second skin. He looked over at Jimmy, whose knuckles were still white on the control yoke. Jimmy met his gaze, a new, fierce respect in his eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It worked," he said, his voice quiet but intense. Art looked back at the four gun muzzles, now silent and cooling. He saw the spent casings littering the floor. He remembered the Zero's panicked break. It had been ugly, desperate, and inefficient. But it had worked. He turned back to Jimmy, his own voice steady now, filled with a cold, hard certainty. "It worked," he agreed. "But it's not enough. We need all of them." The hangar was a tomb of shadows and silence, a sacred space where the ghosts of doubt and ambition waged a silent war. A single, bare bulb hanging from a wire cast a wobbly pool of jaundiced light onto the nose of the B-25, making the aluminum skin look sickly and pale. The air was cold, carrying the metallic tang of cutting oil and the faint, sweet smell of aviation fuel. Outside, the Pacific night was alive with the hum of insects and the distant, muffled roar of the ocean. But in here, the only sounds were the intimate, precise noises of creation. Screech, screech. The sound of a ratchet wrench was metronomic, a prayer in the gloom. Art Lynch, his face smeared with grime and sweat, hung half inside an access panel he'd cut into the bomber's nose. His world had narrowed to the feel of the cold steel in his hands, the alignment of a bolt, the satisfying click of a torque wrench hitting its specified value. Four additional Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns lay on canvas tarps beside him, their mechanisms gleaming with a light coat of protective oil, waiting for their baptism. He was not alone. Across from him, moving with a slow, deliberate reluctance, was Mike Rostov. The staff sergeant's manual was nowhere in sight. Instead, he held a drill press, its electric whine piercing the silence as he bored precise holes for the new mounting brackets Art had designed. Rostov didn't speak. His participation was a silent, brooding rebellion against everything he believed in, a surrender forced by the memory of the Zero breaking away, by the cold look in the colonel's eyes, by the simple, terrifying fact that Art's madness had kept them alive. "Pass me the starboard reinforcement bracket," Art said, his voice hoarse. "The one with the 30-degree bend." Rostov wordlessly picked up the heavy, custom-forged steel bracket. He hefted it, feeling its solid, undeniable weight. "This is $112 of taxpayer money, Lynch," he muttered, the first thing he'd said in an hour. "Just for this one piece." "It's $112 to keep the wings from shearing off," Art replied, not looking up as he took the bracket. His hands, guided by a deep, instinctual understanding of stress and counterstress, positioned it against the airframe's longeron. He began to bolt it in, each turn of the wrench a confirmation of his father's lessons. Listen to the machine. He could feel the airframe's potential, its hidden strength. He wasn't violating the plane. He was unlocking it. The hangar door creaked open, letting in a sliver of moonlight and the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Jimmy Crow slipped inside, his flight jacket zipped against the chill. He moved quietly to a stack of crates and sat, watching the two sergeants work. He didn't offer to help. This was a surgery he wasn't qualified to perform. For another hour, the only sounds were the tools. The whir of the drill, the click of the ratchet, the soft hiss of a hydraulic line being bled. The 8-gun battery slowly took shape, a bristling, terrifying promise of destruction. The plane was being reborn, its purpose transformed from a high-altitude bomber to a low-level Avenger. Finally, Art slid out from the access panel. He was exhausted, his muscles trembling with fatigue. He walked over to where Jimmy sat and slumped down beside him, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through his trousers. He wiped his face with a greasy rag, but it only smeared the dirt further. In the dim light, Jimmy saw the sheen in Art's eyes. It wasn't from the strain or the grease. It was the weight of it all, the colossal responsibility that had settled on his shoulders. "My father," Art began, his voice barely a whisper. "He taught me that a broken machine is a promise you make to fix it. But this—" he gestured weakly towards the transformed bomber, its new guns looking like the spines of some prehistoric predator. "If I'm wrong, Jimmy, if my listening is off, even by a little, I'm not just breaking a promise. I'm getting you killed. I'm getting everyone on this crew killed. For an idea." The confession hung in the cold air, more vulnerable than any scream. This was the true cost of the impossible. It wasn't just defying engineers, it was carrying the lives of your friends in your hands. Jimmy didn't offer platitudes. He just nodded, his own face grave. "I know." The work was done. The tools were silent. The 8 guns were mounted, their feeds connected, their charging handles ready. All that remained was the test. Art stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He walked to the makeshift firing console, a mess of wires and switches he'd soldered together himself. Rostov took a step back, his face a mask of conflicted dread. Art's hand, grimy and trembling, hovered over the master trigger switch. The entire hangar seemed to be holding its breath. The distant ocean, the humming insects, the very wind. It all fell away into a profound, absolute silence, heavier than any sound he had ever known. He drew a sharp breath. His finger touched the switch. The world snapped back into focus with the violence of a slamming door. The flak burst that had torn through the cockpit left Art's ears ringing. A high-pitched whine layered over the deeper roar of the dying starboard engine and the shriek of wind through shattered plexiglass. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid stink of electrical fire. Jimmy Crow was slumped in his seat, a jagged shard of plexiglass embedded in his shoulder, his flight jacket dark and wet. His breathing was ragged, his face ashen. "Art, the controls," he grunted, his hands weakly grasping the yoke. Art didn't think. He acted. His mechanic's mind, trained to diagnose failure, instantly took inventory of the plane's traumas. The starboard R-2600 was seizing, its propeller windmilling with a terrible, grinding shriek. A fine mist of hydraulic fluid painted the inside of the cockpit. The control cables felt sloppy, unresponsive. "I've got it, Jimmy. I've got it," Art yelled, his voice raw. He wrapped his hands around the co-pilot's yoke, his grip firm. He could feel the pain of the machine through the vibrations in the steel. It was listing to the right, dragging them down towards the churning, white-capped sea just 50 feet below. The destroyer Yukikes was already turning, its remaining guns tracking them for the kill shot. The manual, Rostov's sacred text, screamed one thing: climb, gain altitude, escape. But Art knew that was a death sentence. The struggling B-25 could never outclimb the Japanese gunners. So he listened to the deeper truth, the one his father had taught him. He listened to the machine itself. Instead of pulling back on the yoke, he shoved it forward. The nose dipped sharply. Rostov screamed from the back, "Lynch, what are you doing?" They were so low now that the propellers whipped the sea surface into a froth, casting a cold, salty spray across the broken windshield. The altimeter needle quivered at 20 feet. He was using the sea itself, the spray and the chaos of their own wake, as a smokescreen. He fed power to the port engine, wrestling with the rudder to counteract the yaw of the dead starboard engine. It was a brutal, physical fight. Every muscle in his arms and back strained as he aimed the entire, shuddering aircraft like a rifle. The B-25 was no longer a bomber. It was a bullet. And he was pointing it at the destroyer's most vulnerable point, the waterline amidships. The ukikes filled the world, a towering cliff of gray steel. He could see the frantic movements of the Japanese sailors on deck, the blinding flashes of the anti-aircraft guns trying to depress far enough to hit them. Tracers zipped past the canopy, but they were flying too low, too fast, an impossible, suicidal profile. Rostov. Ammo check. All guns. Art barked into the interphone. Port bank green. Starboards jammed. Feed mechanisms hit. Rostov's voice was tight with panic. It didn't matter. 6 guns would have to be enough. Art's eyes were locked ahead. His world narrowed to the patch of steel hull just above the waterline. He adjusted with minute, instinctive movements of the throttles and rudder, his body feeling the drag, the torque, the very soul of the crippled plane. He was one with the machine, a conductor of its final, devastating symphony. At 200 yards, the range was point-blank. The destroyer was a wall. There was no more sky. Art took one last, sharp breath, his finger curling around the trigger on the yoke. "For Jimmy," he whispered. Then he screamed, "Now!" He pressed the trigger. The sound was apocalyptic. It was the sound of the impossible made real. The 6 functioning Browning M2s erupted in a unified, ripping roar that dwarfed anything that had come before. A solid 6-foot-long tongue of pure flame erupted from the nose of the B-25. The recoil hammered the airframe, slamming Art back in his seat, but the reinforced longerons held. The storm of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiaries did not just impact the destroyer, they consumed it. At that range, the steel hull might as well have been paper. The concentrated fire tore into the ukike's vitals, a surgical lance of pure destruction. Waterline plates buckled and shattered. The explosion was not external. It was a deep, gut-punch whump from within the ship as the shells found a magazine or a boiler. A geyser of steam, fire, and shredded metal erupted from the destroyer's side. The great warship shuddered, its turn arrested, its back broken. Art held the trigger down, pouring fire into the widening wound until the last of his ammunition was spent, the guns clicking empty. He hauled back on the yoke with all his strength, the wounded B-25 groaning in protest, clawing for a few precious feet of altitude as they streaked past the dying vessel. He didn't see the rest of the kill. He felt it. A secondary explosion rocked the sea behind them, a shock wave that buffeted their plane. In the reflection of his oily windshield, he saw a pillar of fire and black smoke reaching for the sky where the ukikes had been. The impossible shot had been fired, and it had found its mark. The silence was the first shock. After 3 days of constant skull-shattering noise, the roar of the guns, the scream of engines, the concussive blast of explosions, the only sound inside the avenging angel was the mournful whistle of wind through 100 shrapnel holes. The second shock was the smell. The acrid tang of cordite had seeped into the very metal of the plane, mixing with the coppery scent of dried blood and the faint, sickly sweet odor of seared insulation. It was the smell of a machine pushed to its absolute limit, and beyond. They landed on a rough, hastily repaired strip on New Guinea, the battered B-25 groaning and shuddering as its tires touched the coral. When the last engine coughed and fell silent, the silence became absolute, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Art sat frozen in the co-pilot's seat, his hands still locked in a death grip on the yoke. He couldn't feel his fingers. He looked over at Jimmy, who was pale but conscious, being carefully extracted by the medics who swarmed the plane. Jimmy gave him a weak, bloody smile and a thumbs up before being carried away on a stretcher. Art unbuckled his harness and stood, his legs buckling under him. He had to use the bulkhead for support. He stumbled through the fuselage, his eyes taking in the damage. It was a miracle they were alive. The skin was peppered with thousands of holes. Control cables hung like severed tendons. The starboard engine was a grotesque sculpture of shredded metal. But it was the waist gunner's position that stopped him cold. The space where Mike Rostov should have been was a nightmare. The metal was torn and curled inward, stained dark. A single, empty .50 caliber brass casing lay in a corner, gleaming dully. Rostov's flak jacket was still hanging on a hook, a neat, by-the-book gesture from a man who believed in order. He was gone. Vanished in the flak burst that had saved them, the one that had given Art the split-second opening for the final kill. The victory celebration that night at the base was a raucous, desperate affair. Someone had gotten hold of a case of warm beer. Pilots and ground crews slapped Art on the back, their voices too loud, their laughter too sharp. An intelligence officer stood on a crate, announcing the confirmed tally to a roaring crowd. Listen up. In 3 days, one plane, the Avenging Angel, has been confirmed to have sunk 12 enemy vessels. 12. From patrol boats to a Kajiro-class destroyer. You hear that, boys? 12 ships. The number hung in the humid air, a monument to the impossible. 12 ships. The engineer's fantasy had rewritten the rules of aerial combat in 72 hours. They were heroes. Legends. Art tried to smile, to accept the handshakes, but his face felt like a stone mask. The number 12 was a hollow echo. It was dwarfed by another number, a smaller, more devastating one. 1. He found a quiet spot on the edge of the tarmac, away from the lights and the noise, and sat with his back against a fuel drum, looking at the darkened hangar where the Angel was being tended to by mechanics with reverence. He didn't see the victorious gunship. He saw a lonely cot in the barracks, perfectly made, a pair of polished boots placed neatly underneath. He saw Rostov's face, not in anger, but in that final moment of shared, terrified understanding in the hangar. The by-the-book sergeant had, in the end, trusted the mechanic's heresy with his life. And it had cost him everything. The celebration felt like a sacrilege. The cost of the impossible was not measured in rivets or stress loads. It was measured in the empty space where a friend should be. The weight of it settled on Art's shoulders, heavier than any machine gun, more crushing than any failing airframe. He was still sitting there when a figure approached, silhouetted against the distant party lights. It wasn't a medic or a fellow pilot. It was a general, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. He stood over Art for a long moment, looking not at him, but at the scarred and silent form of the B-25 in the hangar. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't mention the 12 ships. He simply asked, his voice low and steady, "Can you teach others, Sergeant Lynch? Can you build more?" The question hung in the night air, a new kind of burden, a new impossible task. The war wasn't over. The machine had to keep talking. The war did not end with a bang, but with a long, slow exhalation of smoke and memory. For Art Lynch, the final days were a blur of muted colors and hollow sounds. There were no more roaring guns, no more desperate, low-level runs. The Avenging Angel sat in a hangar half a world away, her war done, a relic already being studied by the very engineers who had once called her impossible. Here, on this captured airfield in the Philippines, the silence was a physical thing. He stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching the medics work. Their movements were slow, methodical, and utterly devoid of the frantic energy of combat. They moved among the ruined towns and the broken men not with triumph, but with a weary reverence. The air smelled of rain, wet earth, and the faint, persistent odor of corruption, the smell of a world healing from a festering wound. A slow, gray drizzle began to fall, plastering his hair to his forehead and tracing cold paths down his neck. He didn't move. His mind drifted from the medics to the mechanics. In hangars just like this one, across the Pacific, they were following his schematics, his notes, his heresy. They were building more. B-25s were being transformed, their noses brutalized into the same shotgun snout he had dreamed up in the Arizona dust. The Lynch modification was no longer an experiment, it was a doctrine. He had taught them. He had built more. The general's question had been answered, and the answer was changing the war. But the victory felt like ash in his mouth. He thought of Rostov, not the stubborn by-the-book sergeant, but the man who, in the end, had picked up a drill press in a silent hangar and trusted him. He thought of the empty cot, the polished boots. He thought of the countless other cots, the other boots, the other faces swallowed by the immense, hungry machine of war. His invention had saved lives, had sunk ships, had maybe even shortened the war. But it had not saved Mike Rostov. That was an equation that would never balance. A jeep rumbled past, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt, dragging him back to the present. He looked down at his hands. The calluses were still there, the permanent grime under his nails etched in like a tattoo. They were a mechanic's hands. They had listened to locomotives, to Browning M2S, to the groaning airframe of a B-25 pushed beyond all sane limits. They had built the impossible. But now, in the silence, he wondered what his father would say. Would he be proud of the machine his son had built? Or would he mourn the reason it had to be built? The integrity was in the metal, yes. It was strong. It had held. But the cost of that strength was etched into the soul of the man who had forged it. He had kept his promise. He had made the machines talk back. But he now knew their language was not one of triumph, but of loss and necessity, a painful, roaring dialect spoken only when the world is on fire. The final, haunting truth settled over him, as cold and gentle as the rain. He was not a hero who had built a legend. He was a mechanic who had fixed a broken world with the only tools he had, and he would spend the rest of his life listening to the echo of what it cost. This story, like so many from that war, is just one thread in a vast tapestry of courage, sacrifice, and unimaginable ingenuity. If you carry this memory of Art Lynch and Mike Rostov with you, please honor their legacy by sharing this story, so we never forget the price of the impossible and the quiet men who delivered it. Subscribe for more stories lost to history.